Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Over the years, I have had many people make the statement to me, communism has failed. So why are you a communist? And I have come up with a variety of answers, but none of them were really satisfactory until this second time as a Maoist third worldist. I gave the matter further reflection. Now, I wonder why this answer did not occur to me earlier, but perhaps the answer would not have made sense before thinking about it from a Maoist third worldist perspective. The reason is, I think, because communism, even in the third world, is difficult to sustain under the capitalist world system. Is it impossible? Not impossible necessarily. I mean, obviously, communism was established in various places, like in the Soviet Union, in mainland China, in Cuba, a place that I love, and I wish that Fidel was still around, and other places. So, not impossible. But I guess the key word for me is sustain. Where is communism now? It's basically dying. Not entirely dead, but it's pretty close to being dead. Certainly, the world is dominated by capitalism, which is why Immanuel Wallerstein called the world that we have today the capitalist world system. We do not have a socialist or communist world system. So the fact that capitalism is the dominant economy of the world, I think makes it virtually impossible for communism or revolutionary socialism to thrive, to develop, to grow, and most importantly, to last in the world today. And that is the answer that I have now. And I wonder now why I did not come up with it a long time ago. But maybe not. Maybe I really could not come up with it until I really reflected on it using Maoism, third worldism as a starting point. So I am grateful that I finally have an answer. So the next time, if there is a next time, that someone asks me that question, I will have an answer. I will be able to answer them in a way that I think will make some sense. I will tell them, I will say, well, look, what is the world? What is the only superpower remaining in the world? It is the United States. During the Cold War, you had a battle between two superpowers, the US and the USSR. That battle maintained an uneasy balance between socialism and capitalism in the world. But it did not create an environment where socialism or communism would have a degree of success that would enable it to last for any extended period, meaning there was a great deal of instability in the world. The Cold War, which I remember vividly, having lived through, I guess, more than half of it, given my age, was not a very pleasant time. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, or more accurately, the Turkish Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember it. I know how many times now that the CIA attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro. I remember the Vietnam War. My lottery number was 3. If you don't know what that means, I will tell you. Lottery in the US for the Vietnam War was 1 to 365. The lower your lottery number, the more quickly it was that you would be drafted. So because my lottery number was 3, literally as soon as I was eligible to be drafted, I would be drafted. I think, but I'm not entirely sure. I was having a conversation with another Maoist third worldist over the phone the other day, and for the first time, it occurred to me that because of my autism, which at that time was called schizophrenia childhood type, maybe I would not have been drafted after all. I don't think they would have wanted somebody with a diagnosis, really a misdiagnosis, of schizophrenia fighting in the Indochina War. So that might have kept me out. If it wouldn't have, I would have been among the many Americans who would have left the United States and moved to Canada. I had planned to do that. I had discussed it with others. I had not finalized any of those plans because it was a little bit too early. And then all of a sudden, Nixon canceled the draft. Now, why did he cancel the draft? Was it because he suddenly had a change of heart? No. He canceled the draft because there was literally no American support for it. At the time, I remember the story, and I don't know if it is true. I can't vouch for it. But supposedly, Secretary of State, originally National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, went into Nixon's office, maybe the Oval Office, I'm not sure, and began crying in front of Nixon, begging Nixon not to end the Indochina War. The problem was that Nixon was looking at the matter as a diplomat, if you could indeed call him that. I guess technically he was, but he was really a war criminal, which is how I prefer to think of him. He was a really, really bad man. But Nixon did not have that privilege. He was not a diplomat, he was a politician. And he looked and he saw and he thought to himself, I imagine, I would not want to get into that guy's head. No, I really can't continue this war. I just can't continue it. So he ended it. He ended it literally 2 years before I would have been drafted. And so I was saved from going into Indochina. I did not have to worry about it. The issue of my autism never came up. Well, it wasn't called autism, obviously, but the issue of my schizophrenia supposedly never came up. And so I was able to go on living my life in the US without ever moving to Canada. It was a really difficult time, a difficult time for a lot of people, but especially for people like me, who in 1978 became communists, and instead of being sympathetic to the US, became sympathetic to the other side of the Cold War. And we were witnesses to the end of a war, the end of a war that was literally, at least to me, being fought against my own interests. I did not want to see the Indochina War. I was unhappy about the Cold War. But as an individual person, I guess you could say a civilian, I really had no power over it. I couldn't change the course of events. But when I think back on that again, and I recall that Nixon went into the office crying, and that Nixon only died recently. I believe he was 100 or 101 or something like that. I am happy he lived a really long life. I had hoped that he would live a really long life, not because I was a well-wisher of Nixon's well-being, quite to the contrary, but because I wanted to see that Nixon would witness that all of his efforts, that all of his war crimes that he committed under the presidencies of Nixon, and I suppose during the Ford administration, although during the Ford administration, the war was already over. So primarily, I guess, during the Nixon administration, I was happy that he witnessed that all of his dreams of a war in Indochina fell right before him, that nothing came of them. And now Vietnam might as well be an ally of the United States. Vietnam is not a communist country anymore. There are no more Viet Cong. Vietnam has largely, not entirely, but largely become capitalist, or maybe you could say quasi-capitalist. But such has been the fate of much of the previous communist world. There is no communist world per se. I mean, you can point to individual places that arguably might still be communist to one degree or another, but the left is dead. And it sadly has been dead for a long time. So Nixon saw his dreams collapse into the ashes. That lousy war criminal, that unindicted war criminal who should have been arrested, who should have been tried, and as far as I'm concerned, should have been executed for his war crimes. But no, he lived to 100 years or longer, and I am happy about that. I also celebrated his death. When he died, I was grateful, but I'm happy that he did not die sooner. He died after he saw that all the efforts that he had placed into that war in Indochina, and in particular in Vietnam, had totally fallen apart. So the dreams of a neoconservative, one of the most prominent neoconservatives, Henry Kissinger, turned into a nightmare for him. Not for me, but for him. And I feel really, really good about that. Really, really good about that. But again, going back to the subject, I never really knew before how to explain to people why it is that communism in Russia, the Soviet Union, we used to call it Russia, in mainland China, and so forth, had basically fallen apart. I mean, I had some answers, but the answers really were not that satisfactory. And so I recall always thinking, I hope that this person does not ask me that question, because I really had no satisfactory answer. But now I do. Now I can say, well, We live in the capitalist world system, and sustaining communism under the capitalist world system is difficult. Whether you have it under the Cold War, where you have a clash of ideologies, or now, where there is no more Cold War per se, but you just have the US as the sole superpower, so-called. How in the world can a communist country thrive? I think it was almost predictable that after the death of Fidel, that communism would fall apart. Not only that, but Fidel's brother was certainly not as committed to the cause of communism as Fidel himself was. So I think that his brother looked at it in a much different way. And so I really did not think that communism would last that long. When I saw Obama establish relationships with Cuba and basically open the door to trade with Cuba, a door that was then shut quickly by President Trump. At that point, during the Obama administration, I knew that Cuba would soon experience its communist demise. And sadly, I was correct. And so we live in a world which is not based on communism. There is no communist or socialist world system. There never was, but at least we had some countries that stood up for communist principles. Now, no, not really, except to a very, very limited extent. So that is my explanation. Whether it is right or wrong, I don't know. I hope other people will respond to what I have said and offer their own thoughts on the subject. To be honest, I have never heard or read anyone say what I just said. And I have read quite a bit on the collapse of the Soviet Union, on the transformation of mainland China from communist into authoritarian capitalist, on the collapse of Cuba as a communist country, on the collapse of Vietnam virtually as a communist country. And no one that I have read has put things the way that I have. Maybe I just missed it. Maybe somebody has said what I said, and somehow I did not come across it. That is certainly a possibility. I can't read everything. I have tried to read as much as I can, but obviously I'm just one person. In any event, I hope that what I have said is helpful to you, that maybe that you too will now have an adequate or somewhat adequate response when somebody tells you, perhaps, that communism is dead. I doubt that anybody will ever make that statement to me again. Why? Because I am in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, and nobody here seems to care one way or the other. I walk around with what I call my commie attire, like what I'm wearing now, my Antifa cap, my Shea t-shirt, and nobody ever stops me. When I was in Kansas, I would get stopped on a regular basis and questioned, not interrogated, but questioned. I remember walking up the steps to my apartments in Kansas, and I was wearing a communist t-shirt. And this guy with a deep Southern accent, and you don't meet many people with deep Southern accents in Kansas, stopped me and said, what is that t-shirt? And I turned to him and I said, well, I'm a communist. I guess he thought he had a gotcha that maybe I would be trapped. I wouldn't know what to say, and I would have to come up with some other explanation. There are many people on the far right who think that communists are hiding so that nobody will find them. No, we are not. The problem is not that we are hiding. The problem is that there are too few of us. Almost everyone I know, not everyone, but almost everyone who is a communist is open about it, talks about it almost constantly. I do. I mean, I walk around like this with different t-shirts, but different commie t-shirts, with different caps, but different commie caps, and nobody stops me anymore, but they used to back when I was in Kansas. I hope that changes. Maybe it will. If it doesn't, so be it. I have no control over what other people say, but I regret the fact that we are still living in a capitalist world system, and the prospects for establishing communism are extremely low right now. Obviously, that can change, maybe, but if that changes, it will need to change beginning in the third world. And it is because communism was not firmly established in a world dominated by the third world that there basically is no more communism. For the most part, there were individual third world countries like Cuba, like Vietnam, which were communist, but they were surrounded by countries that were capitalist. And I think that is what made them unsustainable. So I really am not anxious, to be honest, to see communism established in individual nations right now until the capitalist world system has totally collapsed. Then I think that individual third world nations can begin the process of building a new communist or socialist world system. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and a better day tomorrow.